This is Russian President Vladimir Putin, long before the world knew his name. An unknown mid-ranking KGB officer who went on to become one of the most recognisable leaders on the planet. Since he was first elected, Putin has carefully crafted the image of a macho, hyper-masculine strongman. But beyond the photo ops lies another curated self-portrait, one made of anecdotes he often repeats in interviews.
Those messages are extremely important, not necessarily at face value, but at symbolic value. What is it that he is trying to say?
Here are 3 stories Putin returns to again and again from his life before the Kremlin. Vladimir Putin was born in 1952 in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, a city traumatised by the 872-day Nazi siege of World War II. Hundreds of thousands died, including Putin's older brother. He says his parents barely survived it.
The siege is the background condition for his childhood. It was a city marked by scarcity, by a profound sense of trauma and loss, and a deep fear of vulnerability.
This is where he grew up, a cramped communal apartment with no hot water and a shared toilet.
It was a pretty rough, hard-scrabble existence, and frankly, the young Putin himself seemed to have been a pretty rough, hard-scrabble young kid. You know, he was a bit of a scrapper.
Most of his childhood played out in the Dvor, the shared courtyard between apartment blocks.
The lesson of Dvor culture taught him don't ever back down, even though you're smaller than a lot of the other boys.
He started wrestling and judo, later becoming a black belt. But there's a particular anecdote he likes to recount about his childhood and how he liked to chase rats.
That was all fun and games, until at one point he chased a particularly big rat into a room from which there was no exit, and realising that, the rat turned and was ready to spring, and actually Putin himself ran.
In First Person, a book of interviews published the year he became president, he says he got a quick and lasting lesson from this experience.
If you corner a rat and you leave it no way out, they will fight with unexpected ferocity. He says he drew a conclusion from this: never be cornered and never corner anyone.
Putin says he dreamt of joining the KGB, the Soviet intelligence service.
Работать в органах безопасности мне действительно хотелось где-то. У меня возникло такое желание где-то в школе еще. Но, как и у многих молодых людей.
As a teenager, he says he even turned up at their Leningrad headquarters asking for a job. But they told him to go to university and study law, and that's where they later recruited him.
He joins the KGB not really because of the ideological dimension, but because it seems to be the biggest gang in town.
He says his job within the KGB was to gather information about political opponents, finding out who was doing what and how. Because he spoke German fluently, he was posted to Dresden, East Germany, in 1985. At the time, the Soviet Union still held enormous influence across Eastern Europe. Putin was still in Dresden as mass protests swept across East Germany in late 1989, leading to the fall of the Berlin Wall in November. The following month, a crowd stormed the Dresden headquarters of the Stasi, the feared East German secret police, racing to stop the destruction of files and evidence as the regime was falling.
The Stasi was basically finished that night.
In the book First Person, he recalls how the crowd then turned against the KGB compound across the road, where Putin was watching.
So there he is in the KGB's compound when there's a crowd of East Germans who clearly identify the Soviets, the KGB in particular, as their oppressors. Putin himself goes out and confronts the crowd and says, look, there's a whole collection of soldiers inside with weapons. If you come in, they will have to fire. And he talks them down.
That persuaded the group to withdraw, but fearing further unrest, Putin asked Moscow for backup.
The KGB put in a panicked call to the nearest Soviet garrison, saying, we have a crowd here, we're going to have to send some troops. And they say, look, we can't do anything unless we have orders. We need to have orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent.
Though the Soviet Union didn't collapse until 1991, Putin says he felt it ended that day, and it made a lasting impression.
Прежде всего следует признать, и об этом я уже говорил, что крушение Советского Союза было крупнейшей геополитической катастрофой века. Десятки миллионов наших сограждан и соотечественников оказались за пределами российской территории.
I think that experience in Dresden shaped his obsession with state strength, civil control, and preventing disorder.
After Dresden, Putin stayed on the KGB's books. But he didn't have an official posting. So he returned to Leningrad, started a PhD in mining economics, and says in his ghost-written autobiography he even considered a career in academia. But his former law professor, Anatoly Sobchak, who would soon become the mayor of Leningrad, offered him a job that would change his life. That's how he quietly entered the world of politics. Often unnoticed, he sat right by Sobchak for years. You can see him here, or even here. At the time, no one was paying much attention to the man in the brown coat.
It was actually through the chaotic 1990s that in many ways he really found his genuine talents. And his talents in the 1990s were essentially to be everyone's favourite bagman, everyone's favourite deputy, the guy who can get things done unobtrusively.
He says his time there was some of the most formative years of his career.
It's a small anecdote that Putin tells, and he repeatedly highlights above all others, and that is that Sobchak had such personal trust in him that he gave him a stack of blank signed papers, as he calls them, blank signed letters. So he was authorized to act in the mayor's name. That experience shaped Putin's view of power as something personal, loyal, and indivisible, and that lesson stayed with him long after the Sobchak years.
To this day, he is still surrounded by many of the people he met during his time in the mayor's office. After Sobchak lost an election, Putin moved to Moscow to join the Kremlin in the dying years of President Boris Yeltsin's administration. He rose up the ranks fast. In 1998, he became the head of the new intelligence and security service, the FSB. A year later, Prime Minister.
The so-called family, the people around Yeltsin, were beginning to look for a successor, someone who they thought could be controllable and could be efficient.
Yeltsin's inner circle ensured Putin took charge when Yeltsin stepped down. But to most Russians, he was still a mystery man.
Putin really hadn't struck the public imagination that much. And therefore, when he became, well, first Prime Minister, but then certainly President, there was a sense of who is this man? Which, of course, was very useful for Putin because it more or less meant that he had a blank slate.
It's on that blank slate that Putin built the image of the leader we know today. A man who went from the streets of Leningrad to Russia's top job. In control of the country for more than 25 years, he has become increasingly authoritarian.
I think the pre-Kremlin years tell us a great deal about Putin's operating instincts, but those years are not deterministic. Biography alone, I don't think, explains Putin's choices across his career.
His time in power has also been shaped by wars, economic crises, and repeated clashes with the West. But from the stories he tells, we can get a glimpse into his mindset.
Putin's childhood in post-war Leningrad, his KGB training, the events in Dresden, the chaos of the 1990s clearly, I think, instilled deep instincts in Putin about vulnerability, loyalty, and the dangers of state collapse.